What would you do if you found out your government had been experimenting on its own citizens? Not enemies, not prisoners of war, not volunteers who signed clear consent forms, just ordinary people. People like you. People who went to the doctor for a checkup and became part of a secret study they never agreed to. People who joined the military to serve their country and ended up as human guinea pigs. People who trusted the system and paid for that trust with their lives. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And here's the part that should terrify you. One of the experiments I'm about to tell you about only became public because a single file was misfiled in a government archive. If not for that bureaucratic accident, a paper put in the wrong box, we might still believe it never happened. I'll save that one for last. First, let me take you to Alabama, to the 1930s, to a study that lasted 40 years and destroyed hundreds of lives. A study that didn't just happen in some distant dictatorship. It happened here, in the United States of America. 1932, Macon County, Alabama. The United States Public Health Service launches a study. They call it the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. Let those words sink in. Untreated. They weren't studying how to cure syphilis. They were studying what happens when you don't cure it. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis, 201 healthy men as a control group. These men were poor, sharecroppers. Most couldn't read or write. They were promised something they desperately needed: free medical care, free hot meals on clinic days, a burial stipend for their families when they died. What they got instead was betrayal. They were never told they had syphilis. Doctors used the term bad blood, a vague phrase that could mean almost anything. They were given aspirin, iron supplements, placebos. They were told these were treatments. Meanwhile, the doctors watched. They documented. They waited to see how long it would take for their patients to go blind, go insane, or die. In the 1940s, penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis. It was safe. It was effective. It could have saved these men. The researchers made a decision. They withheld it. In 1941, some of the men were drafted into the military. Military doctors diagnosed them with syphilis and ordered them to be treated. One of the study's doctors used a personal friendship with the local draft board to have those men excused from treatment. He wrote to his colleague, "So far, we are keeping the known positive patients from getting treatment." Think about that. They actively intervened to prevent these men from being cured, to preserve the integrity of their study. The study continued for 40 years. By the time it was exposed in 1972, 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 more from complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. When a reporter finally broke the story, the nation was horrified. But here's the question that still haunts me. How many people knew? How many doctors, researchers, and officials watched this happen and said nothing? The study wasn't a secret. It was published in medical journals. Other doctors read about it. No one spoke up. Not until 1972. Not until a young venereal disease interviewer named Peter Buxton tried repeatedly to stop it, failed, and finally went to the press. The study ended because one person refused to look away. But for the men of Tuskegee, it was already too late. Now, let me take you to Philadelphia, to Holmesburg Prison. Between 1951 and 1974, this prison became something horrifying, the largest human testing facility in American history. The man behind it was Dr. Albert Kligman, a dermatologist from the University of Pennsylvania. When he first walked into Holmesburg, he reportedly looked at the prisoners and said, "All I saw before me was acres of skin. Acres of skin. Not human beings, not men with families, with hopes, with futures, just experimental material waiting to be used, and used they were. Hundreds of prisoners, most of them black, most poorly educated, were paid small sums to participate in experiments. They were dosed with LSD, exposed to dioxin, the chemical in Agent Orange, painted with powerful experimental drugs and watched for reactions, injected with radioactive materials. They weren't told what was being done to them. They weren't warned about the risks. They just knew they needed the money. One prisoner, Edward Anthony, participated in experiments for years. He developed scars all over his body. He experienced personality changes. His life was essentially destroyed. When journalist Alan Hornblum wrote about Holmesburg, He described Anthony as basically a human guinea pig who gave his body to science without understanding what he was giving up. The experiments were funded by major pharmaceutical companies, by the military, by government agencies. They all knew. They all benefited. And when the experiments ended, the prisoners were sent home. No follow-up. No treatment for the damage done. No acknowledgement that they had been used. Holmesburg Prison closed in the 1990s. Today, it stands empty. But the men who were experimented on, they're still living with the consequences. Some are dead now. Some are still trying to get compensation. Still trying to get someone to admit what was done to them. Still waiting. Now let me take you somewhere even more disturbing. American hospitals, where patients were deliberately exposed to radiation without their knowledge. Between the 1940s and 1970s, the U.S. government funded hundreds of experiments involving radioactive materials. The subjects? Often the most vulnerable people in society. Pregnant women were given radioactive iron to drink so scientists could study how iron moves through the placenta. They weren't told about the radiation. They were just told it was a vitamin cocktail. Children at a state school in Massachusetts were fed radioactive oatmeal. Their parents weren't told. The children weren't told. They just ate their breakfast while researchers measured how much radiation their bodies absorbed. Patients with cancer were injected with plutonium without their consent, so scientists could study how plutonium moves through the human body. Many of these patients had no idea they'd been injected with anything unusual. They thought they were receiving treatment. In one particularly chilling case, a 36-year-old man named Elmer Allen was injected with plutonium in 1947 at a California hospital. He was told it was a diagnostic test. He wasn't told it was an experiment. He wasn't told about the radiation. He lived for decades afterward, never knowing what had been done to him, until government documents were declassified in the 1990s. By then, it was too late to do anything about it. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments later identified hundreds of such experiments. Their final report, released in 1995, concluded that the government had failed to live up to its own values and principles. That's a diplomatic way of saying they experimented on their own citizens and never told them. Now we come to the story I promised you, the one that only came to light because a single file was misfiled in a government archive. MKULTRA, the CIA's secret mind control program, launched in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. The goal: find a way to control the human mind, to create programmable assassins, to develop truth drugs that could break enemy spies. The methods: drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and in at least one case, radiation. The victims: unwitting American citizens. In San Francisco, the CIA ran safe houses where prostitutes would bring clients who were secretly dosed with LSD, while government researchers watched from behind one-way mirrors. They called it Operation Midnight Climax. In New York, Dr. Harold Abramson, a respected physician, dosed patients with LSD without telling them. He was studying the drug's effects. His patients thought they were receiving legitimate treatment. In Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron, the first president of the World Psychiatric Association, ran a program called Psychic Driving. Funded by the CIA, he subjected patients to weeks of sensory deprivation, massive doses of LSD, and recorded messages played through headphones up to 16 hours a day. His patients emerged with shattered memories, destroyed personalities, permanent damage. Many never recovered. But here's where the misfiled document comes in. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. 20,000 documents. Gone. Shredded. Burned. Erased. He thought that was the end of it. But some records had been misfiled, accidentally placed in the wrong boxes, sent to the wrong archives. Years later, when journalists and congressional investigators started digging, they found those misfiled documents. And suddenly, the full scope of MKUltra began to emerge. If not for that bureaucratic error, a piece of paper in the wrong folder, we might never have known. The church committee hearings in the 1970s exposed MKUltra to the public. Families learned what had been done to their loved ones. Victims finally understood why their lives had been destroyed. But by then, most of the perpetrators were dead or retired. And the government? They apologized, they paid some settlements, they promised it would never happen again. But here's the question that document leaves us with. What else is still sitting in a misfiled box somewhere, waiting to be found? Now let me take you to a place that should make your blood run cold. Experiments on children. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA funded research at the Sonoma State Hospital in California, a facility for children with developmental disabilities. The children were deliberately infected with hepatitis. Their parents weren't told, the children certainly weren't told. They just got sick, and researchers watched. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, children were fed radioactive oatmeal. They were part of a science club. They thought they were doing something special. They weren't told about the radiation. In New York, children at the Willowbrook State School were deliberately infected with hepatitis as part of a study. The researchers argued that since the children would probably get hepatitis anyway, it was acceptable to infect them on purpose. The children were mentally disabled. Their parents gave consent, but were they truly informed? Did they understand what deliberately infected meant? In Denmark, the CIA's MKULTRA program extended to children. Between 1960 and 1970, 311 Danish children, many of them orphans, were subjected to horrific experiments. They were strapped to chairs, blasted with noise, forced to answer disturbing questionnaires designed to break down their psychological defenses. The goal: study how stress affects the mind. The children weren't told what was happening. They were just told it was an experiment. They trusted the adults in white coats. One of those children, Paul Winnicke, is now an old man. He still remembers. He still has nightmares. He still doesn't fully understand why anyone would do that to a child. When he finally learned the truth, that the experiments were funded by the CIA, he said, "I felt betrayed, not just for myself, for all of us." The Danish government has apologized. The CIA never has. And here's the question that should haunt every parent watching this. If it happened once, it can happen again. If children were experimented on then, what safeguards protect children now, and are those safeguards strong enough? Now let me show you the pattern. Because if you look at all these cases, Tuskegee, Holmesburg, the radiation experiments, MKULTRA, Portendown, the children, a pattern emerges. It's never the powerful who are experimented on. It's never the well-connected. It's never the people who can fight back. It's the poor, the imprisoned, the institutionalized, the racial minorities, the orphans, the people society has already forgotten. In Tuskegee, they chose black sharecroppers who couldn't read. In Holmesburg, they chose prisoners who needed money. In the radiation experiments, they chose patients who trusted their doctors. In MKULTRA, they chose prostitutes and mental patients. In Portendown, they chose young servicemen who trusted their country. In the child experiments, they chose orphans and disabled kids who had no one to speak for them. That's not coincidence. That's design. The people running these experiments knew exactly what they were doing. They chose subjects who wouldn't be believed, who wouldn't have access to lawyers, who wouldn't make headlines if something went wrong. And when something did go wrong, when people got sick or died or had their lives destroyed, the system closed ranks. Documents were destroyed. Inquests were held in secret. Families were threatened with the Official Secrets Act. Perpetrators retired with full pensions and good reputations. The victims, they got silence. And if they were lucky, decades later, they got an apology. But here's the thing about apologies. They don't bring back the dead. They don't cure the diseases. They don't undo the damage to children who are now old, still carrying the scars. Apologies are cheap. Accountability is expensive. And in these cases, accountability almost never came. So why does any of this matter? It happened decades ago. The people involved are dead or retired. The programs are shut down. We have ethics committees now. We have informed consent. We have safeguards, right? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Every safeguard we have exists because these horrors happened. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects was created because of Tuskegee. The Belmont Report, the foundation of modern research ethics, was written because of these experiments. Informed consent requirements were strengthened because of MKULTRA. We have rules now because people were hurt, but rules are only as good as their enforcement, and enforcement depends on oversight, and oversight depends on transparency, and transparency depends on people like you asking questions. The same dynamic that allowed these experiments to happen still exists. There are still vulnerable populations. There are still researchers under pressure to produce results. There are still government agencies with secrets. The only difference is that now we know what to look for. But knowing isn't enough. Acting is enough. Asking questions is enough. Demanding transparency is enough. Because the misfiled document that exposed MKULTRA, it wasn't found by accident. It was found by someone who was looking. The journalist who broke Tuskegee? He didn't stumble on the story. He pursued it. The families who fought for Ronald Madison's inquest, they didn't give up. They kept pushing for 50 years. The truth doesn't emerge by magic. It emerges because people refuse to let it stay buried. So, here's the question I'll leave you with. What's still sitting in a misfiled box somewhere? What document hasn't been found yet? What program hasn't been exposed? What victims are still waiting for someone to believe them? The history I've told you tonight isn't complete. It can't be. Because we only know what's been revealed. We only know what someone fought to uncover. Plus, there are other stories, other experiments, other victims. Some of them may never come to light, but some of them will. Somewhere, right now, a researcher is filing a FOIA request. A journalist is digging through archives. A family member is asking questions. A survivor is telling their story. And eventually, the truth will out. Not because the system wants it to, because people make it happen. The misfiled document that exposed MKULTRA wasn't a miracle. It was a reminder. Secrets don't stay secret forever. Someone always knows. And sometimes that someone puts a piece of paper in the wrong box. The rest is up to us. They thought if they burned enough documents, waited long enough, and threatened the right people, the truth would die. But truth doesn't die. It just waits for someone to find the misfiled box.